How is everyone doing? I think it's just a little bit of a deep, afternoon deep at this point in time. So during my presentation, I will get you to do some work. Not too much, but just a little bit. So I represent here an approach called SenseMaker. Has anyone heard about SenseMaker before? Can you just raise a hand to give me an idea? Right, okay, so very few people. So this is an approach to understanding what people say by collecting narratives, as in stories and text, and getting people to code those narratives to signify and tell us what they mean in a very structured way. And then, as part of the approach, we work with the results and communicate it back to the stakeholders. And I must admit that this is the most difficult part for us, taking what we have collected, gathering insights, and then feeding them into a decision-making stage, into decision-making side. I'm so sorry, I did forget about that. And feeding them into the decision-making side to make sure that people actually do something about the data and do something about what we've generated. Now, part of the approach is collaboration with stakeholders, collaboration with the country teams, and participatory approach to analysis as well. This is something we're trying to introduce more and more, just to make sure that whoever has to make a decision has access to data in order to make that decision and can make sense of the data themselves in order to make that decision as well. So I'm going to get you to wear different hats today. My presentation is a little bit more hands-on approach, where I will ask you to, first of all, go into the shoes of a beneficiary, of a person who's submitting data, then of a project team who works with the data, and then of the decision maker who is trying to make something out of it. So it's a little bit of a very, very basic level introduction to method, and obviously I'll be very happy to talk about this later on this week as well, if you're interested. So let me just start with introducing who we are and what we do. So we have run a number of projects, SenseMaker projects, all over the world, pretty much. And they vary, the focus varies, the objectives vary, the length vary, and the type of the analysis and research varies as well. So we work with monitoring, evaluation, research, assessment, appraisal. We work with completely different range of organizations and a completely different range of issues. And these are just a couple of examples of what we have done. And some of the people here probably are aware about some of the projects as well. Now, as part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about an example from our most recent project, which is in fact a UNDP project run by the country office in Jordan. And we have just finished the analysis of the baseline data for that project. And this is what I'm going to use to show you how we work through collecting data, analyzing data, and making decisions and informing decision makers. So a couple of things I've mentioned already, but just different focus of our projects. And now this method. So you're going to be very familiar with some of the stages here. So we are asking a question, we're getting people to tell us what they mean when they respond to that question in a series of structured and semi-structured questions. We work with visualizing data as a first step of data analysis, which is aimed to make it very accessible and very easy for people to access that data. So the idea is to make data as user-friendly as we can, by letting people who are not trained in data analysis and who are not data scientists to understand what data talks about at the very high level. Sorry, I'm just going to go back there. Then we're going we're kind of deep diving into what that data means. Who are the people that talk about specific things? What is it that makes them different or interesting or unusual? Are there any weak signals? Are there any strong signals about certain issue we're trying to understand? Then we're trying to facilitate discussions with stakeholders about, well, this is what we have, but what does it mean? We do not know that most of the time as outsiders. And then we're trying to design a lot of safe-to-fail experiments. And I know there were a couple of people who mentioned kind of things going outside of your comfort zone, pushing the boundaries, trying to test assumptions, failing, going again, test them again at a smaller scale before going large. So this is kind of the idea behind the method. And then again, it's not a such a hypothesis testing method. We like to refer to it as hypothesis generating method. So there are a lot of surprises we're trying to see in our data or hoping to see in the data, as well as a lot of things we're specifically looking for. So now I'm going to get you to work a little bit. And again, just bear in mind, someone mentioned earlier on, stay open-minded. Don't judge, just trust me, trust the process. And someone did say that before as well. So what I want you to do is reproduce that triad, just draw it on a piece of paper in front of you, and give me a response to that question. Now, that question comes out of the study in Nepal, and hence it talks about dal, which is a traditional food in that area. So dal is made out of 3 ingredients, and Bangladeshi colleagues here would probably be much better at explaining how it's made than I am. Salt, water, and lentils. Now, what I want you to do, if you ever had dal, give me a response as to how was your dal on the triad you draw in front of you. And I'm going to give you literally 30 seconds to do that.
Can we bring dal in?
After lunch. Okay, first question. I'm going to put a spotlight on the table I landed in, which has a team of Bangladeshi people who are probably most familiar with that than anyone else. So where would you put your response in that triad?
Salt.
Just salt. Any other options? Indian colleagues? And a little bit of salt. Okay, okay. So, did anyone struggle to respond to this question? No. Well, don't be shy. Don't be shy. No, okay. So, hopefully that's what everyone thinks. Basically, what we're trying to do here is to understand the balance between the 3 ingredients that form a certain concept. In this example, is food, a type of food, but sometimes it may be something related to livelihood, or something related to violence, or something related to women's rights. So what we're doing here, we're looking for a balanced responses from population on a specific issue we're trying to understand better. And the reason we're asking the balanced response, we're looking for a balance, is to understand the weight of each of the concepts related to an issue we're exploring. And that gives a very good perspective on how people perceive certain things and how people behave in certain ways as well. So what I want you to do next is to think about this question. And that question came out of the study we did at Jordan. And it's a livelihood project where UNDP has designed 2 programs, training programs, to train Syrian refugees in Jordan, as well as Jordanian local populations who reside in Jordan as well. And the idea is to understand understand the behaviors, understand what contributes to the improved livelihood of both groups, not just the Syrian refugee group, because the relationship between 2 groups is becoming quite an issue in Jordan now. So it's not just the difficulty refugees are experiencing, but also the difficulties local teams, local people are experiencing when accepting refugees to their countries. So, can anyone share an example in response to that question? It can come from anything, pretty much. It can be a personal experience or experience of someone you know. Surely there ought to be one in the room. Yes? And would that be a personal perspective of a or individual living in that community?
Yeah, I mean, if you got 10 blankets and I didn't get any, but I vaccinated use one of my rooms in Sweden for 3 to 6 months, I would be alone.
And that was something you tell, right? So when we ask this question, we're trying to elicit things that people relate to mostly. So it's quite an open-ended question. And if a blanket situation or distribution of relief is something that matters to me most, I'm going to talk about that. So that's the first set of insights we're generating. We're trying to understand what resonates with people and what resonates with populations. What we do then, we ask a series of follow-up questions which may not necessarily be something people already talk about. So you've mentioned blankets, but then in that story about blankets, what did I leverage? What kind of connections did I leverage? Did I leverage my family? Did I feel I belong with my family? Did I feel on my own? Or did I rely on support of the friends in order to get something I wanted to get? So why this question was important in the context of this study was because there was an assumption that if you belong to a family, you're much better well off if you have that network to rely on. If you don't have that network, you're not going to do that well and you need external support. Okay? So we collected data on that question as well as a range of other questions related to the study. And this is what we got. So we got a lot of data points. I highlighted just a little cluster I'm going to talk about now. And what we saw was quite surprising for a project team and for us as well. So all stories you see on this example are negative stories. So I asked people, well, you told us a story. How do you feel about this story? Is it a positive story for you or is it a negative story for you? So if I told a story about blankets, I would say, yes, this is something I don't feel very good about because I was left out and I felt like I shouldn't have. So each dot represents one respondent. So if you did the exercise I asked you to do at the very beginning, your response would be one dot on that triad. So what we have here is a collection of respondents from people, but what we do very quickly with it, we quickly visualize and see where the data lies at that very basic level. So going back to our assumption that living with your family or having a sense of belonging with your family should help you was challenged here because the highlighted cluster is a cluster of negative responses of people who said that they belonged with their families. And that was very surprising because the stories that are about belonging with families should not be negative as such. So we were trying to then understand, well, this is a group of people that talks in a certain way, challenges our assumptions. What is it about them that makes them different? So we kind of went further and we looked at who these guys are and how much of the overall sample they represent. And it appears that out of all negative responses, negative stories in this data set, they're almost 1/3, which is quite a high number. So that's an interesting insight. Also, we looked at the demographics, we looked at where people come from, what they do, what they say. And if you can't read those little gray boxes, I'm just going to highlight 2 main points here. The first one is that 27% in this cluster, compared to the overall data set, came from the specific part of the country. So we know that there is a certain geographical issue associated with how people respond in this way. And then the second point is that there is a socio-demographic characteristic, and the people from this cluster are very different from the rest of the population, and they come from a less responses come from low middle class compared to everything else. So what do we do next? That's an interesting information, but what about, what about it? So we went to look at other questions people responded to, and what we did, we looked at this subset, so we're working with that subset, and we looked at what else people said. So for example, again, you can't really see too much, apologies for that, but for example, that question here has skills, connections, and confidence or independent ability to do something. So we saw that people who said that also said that they did have connections, but they didn't leverage those. So we have family connection that wasn't relied on and wasn't leveraged, which is very unexpected in the context of Jordan. And then we looked at other responses people gave, and it's just a different format or different ways of asking about the story and about experiences. So what we do here, we try to dig deeper to understand what people do, what they say, where they come from, and what makes them different from everyone else. And there was a very interesting finding, which we did not understand until we looked at the narratives. So the next step would be to look at what stories did people share? What did they say? What kind of words they used? What issues they talked about? And it may be something completely different from what we thought of asking. So there was an interesting finding here when we looked at the stories. One of the questions asked about the financial capital. As part of the sustainable livelihood model, financial capital and access to financial capital is deemed to be very, very important. So we asked people about financial capital, not in those words, but trying to understand whether they've got access and what kind of impact that access had on their livelihood strategies and livelihoods. And in fact, we found a few stories where too much access, too much money, had very negative impact. And that's what we struggled to understand. However, when we were at stories, we kind of came across a lot of examples where access to funds, access to loans was not a problem. However, if something happens, people lose everything, they're not able to pay back. So, in effect, access without certain constraints, access to finance without certain constraints or risk checks or security checks made things much worse than no access at all for a certain subset of population. So, what happened here is we had a series of assumptions, we tested those assumptions, we looked at what data tells us about those assumptions and those issues and concepts we were trying to understand. And at the same time, we were open to surprises, and we did find a couple of surprises in the text, in the narratives that we read as well. So that kind of gave us a very, very good perspective of what is going on, and in fact, based on that data, it was meant to be just a baseline data, but based on that data, the programs were redesigned and adjusted slightly because the data was collected prior to the commencement of the programs, just to reflect certain things people talked about and certain things people mentioned as well. So in fact, it served two purposes instead of the intended one. So just a couple of things to summarize what is it that we do that makes it a slightly more different approach than something that you may be familiar with. So we're trying to collect facts. We're asking about questions about specific experience. This cognitively lends people into a very specific place in their lives, and then we ask all follow-up questions about that experience as well. And that helps us to get them focused so that we can collect data as opposed to just opinions as to what they think is happening. So that's kind of one of the main important things. We connect narratives, and thus we're open for surprises. So we have text, we can do text analysis, we can just read narratives, whatever you want to do. But that gives us a lot of contextual information as well. So we get people to code certain things as well for us. So instead of running a qualitative interview and then taking a step back and coding it myself, we would get people to do it for us. Which speeds the process up, it allows us to collect much more data points and increase our sample. And it kind of provides more relevant information as well, because they know what they're talking about. I don't know what they're talking about most of the time. So bringing my perspective is quite dangerous, I think. And in fact, we did an experiment once with the project in Rwanda where the girls, it was a project that was working with mentoring girls who were deemed to be vulnerable at schools. So we had a question where we asked, whether do you actually perceive yourself as being vulnerable or not well connected or something else, I can't remember the exact wording. And none of the girls said that they felt vulnerable. But the program was designed from a perspective, oh, you are vulnerable, I know what to do. I know how to get you out of that space. And there was that disconnect between what the expectation of a program team was and what actually people perceived about the situation themselves. And that made a lot of difference as well. And we compared, we asked some experts to code the narratives And the responses were so different from what people actually said themselves. The triangle question that you saw earlier on, that avoids gaming as much as possible because people don't know which is the right answer as well quite often. So it's constructed. There's a lot of work going into designing the instrument, into the construction of the instrument, a lot of testing as well. But if it's done properly, people should never know or guess which is the right answer, because quite often in development environment, livelihood depends on the external support, and obviously you would want to maintain that external support. So we're trying to minimize that bias a little bit. And then eliciting sensitive issues. So quite often you can't turn around and ask a person, well, your child is HIV positive. How does it influence your livelihood? Because you're not going to get a response detailed enough or informative enough. And quite often there are sensitive issues that people never talk about, or it's a shame to talk about certain things. So we're trying to break that into different questions, and then when we're getting to the analysis, combine those questions together, the responses together, to understand what is it about that issue that a person talks about, or how do they perceive certain things. And that relates to violence quite often as well, especially in schools. So that method helps us deal with that a little bit as well. And then from the analysis side, what do we do? So we visualize data. So we collect data in a way that's easy to visualize, pretty much automatically, so that people who are not trained can have access to that data and play around with it a little bit. We're comparing the data sets, we're comparing subsets, we are looking into the differences across different subsets quite easily as well. We are looking at unexpected, and I know I'm kind of keep coming back to that issue, but it's still very, very, very important. And then we're trying to introduce statistics as much as possible as well, because every dot we collect has coordinates, a set of coordinates assigned to it, so we can monitor the movement. So if we're doing a baseline and an end line, we can see the distance that dot traveled between the two. Text analysis is something we're just starting to understand. So before we just read the narratives, but now we're trying to run statistical analysis, text modeling analysis on the narratives as well. And that allows us to identify, well, if you are a male coming from that part of that country, what are you most likely to talk about? And if you're a woman coming from that country, what are you most likely to talk about? And what kind of factors then contribute to you talking in a specific way? And then generating new hypotheses is something that comes out of the SenseMaker study quite often as well. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about. I know it's a little bit of a hands-on presentation as to how we do things. But I hope that was interesting and useful. And please do ask me any questions if you have in the meantime.